I was standing in line at a minimalist coffee shop in the city this morning, the kind of place where the air smells like expensive beans and quiet desperation. There was this young couple in front of me, probably in their late 20s, hovering over a single laptop. They weren't looking at vacation rentals or wedding venues. They were staring at a compound interest calculator with expressions that looked like they were mourning a death. The woman pointed to a specific number, the projected cost of a modest 3-bedroom house, and just leaned back, exhaling a long, shaky breath. "It's not happening," she said. "Not this decade." At that exact moment, the wall-mounted TV flickered with a breaking news alert. The headline was glowing. "Prosperity Unleashed." A spokesperson in Detroit was shouting over the roar of a factory floor, touting a 4.3% GDP growth and celebrating a stable 2.7% inflation floor as a historic win for the American family. He looked genuinely thrilled. His face lit up with the kind of giddy excitement you'd expect from someone who'd just solved poverty forever. But looking at the back of that couple's heads, the way they just stared at their cooling lattes, that triumph felt like a message sent from a different planet. It was a strange, hollow moment. On one hand, you have the official ledger telling us we're living through a golden age of recovery. On the other, you have a 1.53 fertility rate, a demographic anorexia that suggests a generation has lost all metaphysical confidence in the future. That instantaneous shift from the soaring rhetoric of the news ticker to the visceral silence of that couple made me realize that today's economic data isn't a bulletin, it's an autopsy. We are being told a patient is running a marathon, while the vital signs suggest a systemic liquidation of the independent middle class. What if this prosperity is actually a mirage, and the 2.7% inflation floor is actually a ceiling we're all about to be crushed under?
Wow. That is a striking, almost cinematic image, isn't it? You've got the ticker tape parade happening on the TV screen and this quiet crisis just sitting at a coffee table.
It felt unreal. The disconnect was just palpable.
And honestly, hearing you read that, calling it an autopsy, I can see how that might feel aggressive to some people. It sounds dramatic.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Bit over the top, maybe.
But when we actually laid out the stack of sources for this deep dive, and I mean, we went through economic working papers, the sociological data on suicide and fertility, these internal reports on institutional dysfunction, that word autopsy stops feeling so dramatic.
And it starts feeling
medically accurate. Yeah, like you're looking at a body on a table and trying to figure out the cause of death.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We're going to look past those Prosperity Unleashed headlines and really audit the lived reality of January 2026. Because, usually when we talk about these things, we put them in their own little silos.
Right. We talk about the economy over here.
Or we talk about the loneliness epidemic over there, or, corruption in universities as this completely separate queue.
But the whole point of this deep dive, the reason we pulled these specific sources, is to show they are not separate stories at all.
Not at all. When you dig into the research, you realize that couple in the coffee shop, that 1.53 fertility rate, and the rigged university admissions process, they are the same story.
They are deeply, deeply connected. And we've identified 3 specific threads in the research that kind of weave this whole picture together.
Okay, so what are they?
First, we have to look at the structural mechanics of wealth transfer. And specifically, we need to talk about a concept called the Cantillon effect. That's the money piece.
Right, the money.
Second, we look at the sociological collapse. We're going to use the lens of anomie, a term from Durkheim, to explain why people are retreating, why they feel so lost.
So that's the social fabric?
Exactly. And third, we have to talk about elite capture, which explains why the institutions that are supposed to be the guardians of the system, why they're not fixing any of this.
So we're talking about money, society, and the institutions, the 3 pillars.
Precisely. And we're going to show how the corruption of the first, the money, leads directly to the collapse of the second, the social fabric, while the third pillar, the institutions, basically just watches it happen, or worse, profits from it.
Okay, let's unpack this. And to do that, I want to start where the pain is actually being felt. Not in the data centers, not on a chart, but in people's living rooms.
The human scale.
The human scale. I recently came across this detailed profile, a story about a man named David. He's a senior civil engineer in Ohio.
Yeah.
And, this isn't a guy who made risky bets on crypto or was day trading meme stocks.
No, this is a guy who builds things.
He builds things. He has spent 20 years building the literal foundations of his community, bridges, roads, infrastructure. He is the definition of the play-by-the-rules citizen. He's the guy you're supposed to be able to count on.
The backbone of the middle class. That's what we used to call it.
Exactly. But by January 2026, David found himself staring at a spreadsheet that Well, it just didn't make sense anymore. Despite his steady salary, despite his disciplined savings, this thing we're going to talk about, the Cantillon effect, it was playing out in his own backyard.
How so? What was he seeing?
He watched as a private equity firm, one of those massive, faceless entities, bought an entire block of starter homes. The same homes he had hoped his grown children might be able to buy one day.
And let me guess, the private equity firm didn't pay for it with 20 years of disciplined savings.
Of course not. That's the kicker. They were fueled by cheap, low-interest institutional credit, the kind of money David could never, ever get his hands on. And while the official consumer price index, the CPI, sits at a manageable 2.7%.
Which is what they're cheering about on the news sticker.
Right. Prosperity unleashed. But David's reality was relentless 10% surge in the costs of the things that actually matter. His property taxes, his groceries, his health insurance premiums.
The non-optional parts of life.
The non-optional parts. He described this feeling like a man running up a descending escalator that was just picking up speed. The promise he grew up with, that meritocratic promise that hard work equals stability, it seemed to have been replaced by a system that rewards something else entirely.
Proximity to the money. Proximity
to the monetary spigot, as he put it. And I don't know, looking at David's situation, you just feel this profound sense of exhaustion. It's so easy to dismiss these economic shifts as just data points on a graph, but for the American middle class, this isn't just about money.
No, it's about the social contract. It's about fairness.
It's the dissolution of that contract. When this hidden inflation tax systematically transfers the fruits of your labor to the politically connected, the very idea of a fair go starts to feel like a cruel joke.
And David's story is the perfect entry point for this because it illustrates that this isn't just bad luck. It's not a coincidence. It is a structural mechanic. You mentioned the Cantillon effect.
Yeah, let's break that down.
Yeah.
Because it's a term people might not be familiar with.
For sure. It's a concept that goes way back to the 1730s, named after an Irish-French economist named Richard Cantillon. And his insight was brilliant in its simplicity. Money is not neutral.
Right. I think most people assume that if the government, prints more money, it's like adding water to a swimming pool.
Yeah.
Everyone's water level rises a little bit, right?
That is the common misconception. It's what standard textbook economics often perpetuates. But Cantillon argued that money doesn't enter the economy like a gentle, evenly distributed rain. It enters like a river. It flows from a specific point.
And in our modern system, that point is what, the Federal Reserve?
The central banks, yeah. And the massive financial institutions they do business with. The big banks, the primary dealers. So like a river, the people standing at the source. They get the water first.
They get to drink while the water is still clean and plentiful.
Exactly. They are the first spenders. These are the governments borrowing at low rates, the big banks getting bailout funds, the large corporations issuing debt to buy back their own stock. They get this new created money before it has had a chance to circulate. And this is the absolute key.
Okay.
They get to spend it while prices are still at yesterday's levels. They buy assets, they buy stocks, they buy real estate, in David's case, entire neighborhoods of starter homes. They get the benefit of the new money without the consequence.
And by the time that money flows downstream, all the way to David in Ohio,
the damage is already done. Prices have risen. The last receivers, the wage earners, the pensioners, the people living on a fixed income, the savers, they get the money only after it has bid up the price of everything else. So effectively, their purchasing power has been stolen. It's been transferred from the last receivers to the first spenders.
One of our sources uses this phrase that it really stuck with me: a bureaucratic confiscation of value.
That's it. That's exactly what it is. It reframes inflation completely. We're told inflation is this mysterious weather event, oh, look, prices are up today. Like, it just happens.
But this view says no, inflation is a policy. It's a choice. It's a tax.
It is the most regressive tax imaginable because it doesn't require legislation to pass. And if we look at the data from our sources for 2026, we see this playing out with crystal clarity. There was what economists call a structural break in the economy right around 2020.
A structural break. What does that mean in plain English?
It means the old rules stopped applying. Before 2020, the correlation between the M2 money supply and the wealth of the top 0.1% was strong, but it was, a steady climb. After 2020, it went vertical, a straight line up.
Yeah.
The mechanism of wealth generation fundamentally shifted. It stopped being about productive labor and started being about asset inflation. If you owned asset stocks, real estate, anything the Fed was propping up, you won big. If you sold your labor for a wage, you lost. You fell further and further behind.
And this leads us directly to what David is experiencing with housing. We're calling it the housing trap.
It is a trap in the truest sense of the word. Our source stack shows mortgage rates stabilizing between 5.9% and 6.5%. Now, historically, you might say, well, that's not crazy. My parents had rates higher than that.
Sure, but the house cost a fraction of what it does now.
Exactly. You cannot separate the rate from the price. When you pair today's rates with the asset prices that were driven into the stratosphere by the Cantillon effect, the math just breaks. The interest payments alone are enough to crush a family's purchasing power.
So it forces a shift from owning to renting.
Which is the trap, because where does that rent money go? It funnels right back up to the first spenders, the institutional landlords, the private equity firms that bought David's neighborhood.
It creates a rent-seeking economy.
Correct. And this disconnect is just glaring when you look at the productivity data. One of the papers we looked at showed that since 1979, American productivity has grown by about 60%, a huge increase in efficiency and value. But real pay for the average worker, it grew less than 15%.
So where did the other 45% go?
It didn't just vanish into thin air. It was captured. It was captured by capital owners through things like stock buybacks, which boost share prices, through executive bonuses, and through general asset appreciation. The rewards of productivity were decoupled from the labor that generated it.
So if this is the new economic structure, what does it mean for the structure of society? One of our sources uses a pretty provocative term for it, neo-feudalism.
It sounds medieval, doesn't it? But the analogy is frighteningly accurate when you break it down. In classical feudalism, you had lords who owned the land, and crucially, the means of coordination, and then you had peasants or serfs who worked the land.
Right.
Today, we're seeing what some sociologists are calling a becoming peasant tendency. Think about the gig economy, for instance. You might own your car or you might own your house, but the platform, Uber, Airbnb, Amazon, the big tech giants, they own the means of coordination. They own the network.
And they extract the rent.
They extract the rent. They set the terms. And they operate almost like their own little governments.
Parcellated sovereignty is the term I saw.
That's the one. Corporations like Apple or Amazon act as sovereign powers. They negotiate directly with entire states. They have more power than many countries. And this creates what's called hinterlandization, a deep structural divide not just between rich and poor, but between the rich, global, connected cities, the seats of the lords, and the desolate, divested, post-industrial areas where people like David live, the hinterlands.
It's a grim picture of the economic engine. But, money is just the fuel. The engine is supposed to drive society forward. And if the engine is rigged like this, the passengers inside the car, they start to act differently, don't they?
They absolutely do. When the economic contract breaks, the social contract is always the next thing to go.
Which brings us to our second thread, the social consequence, the anomie. And for this, I saw a video diary recently. A 31-year-old woman named Sarah, who lives in a cramped, incredibly expensive apartment in Seattle. Mm-hmm. And Sarah is just the embodiment of what sociologists might call defensive narcissism, though I'm sure she would never use that term herself. She spends her weekends optimizing her life, the type, curating her digital presence, her gym routines, her career milestones.
Building the perfect personal brand.
Exactly, building a brand. But she remains deeply, profoundly alone. And when her mother asks about grandchildren, Sarah points to the 1.53 national fertility rate, not as some abstract statistic, but as a survival strategy.
It's a rational response.
It is. In her world, the therapeutic state, as one source calls it, tells her she needs to find herself and deconstruct all these traditional roles. But it offers zero support for the organic social bonds that actually make a family possible. For Sarah, a child isn't a joy to be welcomed. It's a financial and an emotional liability that would shatter the fragile stability she's built for herself in this hyperinflationary 2026 world.
So she retreats.
She retreats into herself because the future feels more like a threat than a promise. And I don't know, reading between the lines of her life, you just see this Durkheimian anomie in full effect. It's a society where all the old rules are gone, but the new ones provide no meaning, no stability.
No map.
No map. And it's heartbreaking to realize that our record low fertility rate is, in effect, a biological protest. It's a vote of no confidence against a world that has made the most basic human experience, raising a family, feel like an impossible luxury.
Sarah's story is a tragedy, but it's a tragedy that Emil Durkheim, as you mentioned, predicted over a century ago. He coined this term anomie, and it literally means a state of normlessness. But a better translation might be derangement.
Derangement is a strong word.
It fits, though. Durkheim's core argument was that human beings, We actually need limits. We need structure. We need a map of how to live a good life. And when a society prioritizes infinite choice and ideological deconstruction over stable social bonds, people don't feel free. They feel lost. They feel a sense of vertigo.
And we see that vertigo in the mental health statistics, don't we? The numbers are just staggering.
They are. The data on what's being called the male crisis is particularly stark here. Our sources show suicide rates for men increased by over 35% in the first 2 decades of the century. We have data showing that 15% of men now report having no close friends.
15%. That's 1 in 6 or 7 men with no one to talk to.
It's a complete collapse of the social fabric. When you strip away the traditional structures, religion, strong community groups, the stability of the nuclear family, you leave individuals completely exposed. You leave them without a buffer against the harsh realities of the world.
And Sarah's response, this defensive narcissism you mentioned, is her trying to build her own buffer, right? From scratch.
Exactly. It's a coping mechanism. If you can't rely on the community or your family or the future, you turn inward and you obsess over the self. You optimize the body, the career, the online image. It's a survival strategy.
We see this in what one of our sources calls WASH culture, W-A-S-H, wellness, self-care, bio-optimization.
And it's not about fixing the broken system. It's about adapting the self to survive the broken system. It's about building a better life raft on a sinking ship instead of trying to patch the hull.
I want to go back to that fertility rate again, 1.53. That is remarkably low. Replacement rate is what, 2.1?
2.1, yeah. So we are well below what's needed to sustain a population. And it's not just an American problem. We have this fascinating working paper in our stack that compares fertility intentions in Bulgaria and Hungary.
Right, former Eastern Bloc countries. What can we learn from that?
That paper is crucial because it does something very smart. It differentiates between the intention to ever have a child and the intention to have one now.
Okay. The long-term desire versus the immediate plan.
Precisely. And what they found in these transition economies, which, let's be honest, the U.S. is looking more and more like every day, is that economic uncertainty creates a massive gap between those two things. People say they want kids, the desire's still there, but they keep saying not now, later.
The great now or later dilemma.
And later has a way of becoming never. The study highlights that as anomie rises, as people feel more disoriented and feel that the social rules are unfair, they postpone irreversible commitments. And having a child is the ultimate irreversible commitment, isn't it?
It doesn't get more irreversible than that. It's interesting. The study also mentioned something called social capital as a major factor.
Yes, this is so important. When the state fails you and the market is rigged against you, what do you have left? You have your network, your friends, your family, your neighbors. That's your social capital.
The people you can count on.
The people you can count on. If you have strong social capital, you might still feel secure enough to have kids because you know you have a safety net. But Sarah, alone in that apartment in Seattle, she has no social capital. She is atomized. And without that network, the risk of starting a family is just too high to bear.
So we have the rigged economic system creating precarity, and we have the social collapse stripping away the safety nets. This leads to a deeper concept that's mentioned in our sources: metaphysical confidence.
This is where it all comes together, moving from the sociological to the almost philosophical. A fertility rate of 1.53 isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It is a civilization-wide vote of no confidence in the future.
Wow. Say more about that.
It signals a civilization that has lost the metaphysical belief that tomorrow will be better than today, that its values are worth propagating, that the struggle is worth it. It is, as the opening reading put it, demographic anorexia. A society is starving itself of its own future.
And a civilization can't survive that.
It can't. A civilization cannot survive if it cannot persuade its members to reproduce. Sarah isn't just making a personal financial choice. She is unconsciously signaling that she doesn't trust the world enough to bring a new child into it.
Which is a terrifying thought. If the people stop believing in the future, then the future is effectively canceled. But this brings us to the third pillar. Why isn't anyone fixing this? Why do the institutions, the universities, the media, the government seem so utterly disconnected from the realities of David and Sarah?
And that is the final piece of the puzzle. This is where we have to talk about elite capture.
To get into this, I read an anonymous letter. It was from a man I'm just going to call Julian. He was, until very recently, a former admissions officer at a prestigious Ivy League university, a top-tier school.
Okay, someone on the inside.
Deep on the inside. And by the start of 2026, Julian decided to walk away from his career of 15 years. He just couldn't do it anymore. He described a clinical breakdown of standards. That was his phrase. A situation where the pursuit of objective excellence had been entirely replaced by radical identity politics and social engineering.
And he saw a specific example of this.
A very specific one that haunted him. He recalled a case where a brilliant working-class student, a kid with a real raw passion for classical physics, was passed over. And the spot was given to a candidate who fit a very specific ideological profile, but lacked the foundational rigor that you need for that kind of program.
So they chose ideology over competence.
That's how he saw it. Julian said he felt like he was no longer a gatekeeper of talent, but just a technician in a factory of institutional capture. The media outlets he once trusted, the academic journals, they all felt like echo chambers for this new orthodoxy, leaving people who believed in rational, classical, liberal ideas feeling utterly betrayed.
Like they've been locked out of their own house.
Oh, exactly. And you just feel this deep sense of unease about where our intellectual institutions are heading. When you abandon the gold standard of excellence in favor of social engineering, you don't just lose talent. You lose the trust of the very people who keep the engines of civilization running.
You lose the Davids and the Julians.
Yes. And it's a somber reminder that once those civilizational standards are compromised, they are incredibly difficult to rebuild.
And Julian's experience is a textbook example of elite capture. But we need to define that term carefully because it's often misused as just a political buzzword.
So what's the formal definition?
It actually comes from development economics and political science. It describes a situation where public resources, or in this case, public trust and institutional power, are hijacked by a small group of individuals of superior social status to benefit themselves.
So it's not just simple theft. It's not someone, stealing money from the university till.
No, it's much more subtle and in many ways much more damaging. It's about what one of our sources calls the micropolitics of corruption.
Micropolitics of corruption. I like that.
It's not about bagmen with cash. It's about manipulating meeting records. It's about changing the rules of the hiring committee midstream. It's about using institutional thuggery, like HR complaints and DEI initiatives, to trip up, isolate, or push out anyone who stands up for the old standards. Anyone like Julian.
It sounds like a slow-motion coup that happens inside the institutions themselves.
That is essentially what it is, and the end result is the death of meritocracy. When institutions shift their primary function from objective excellence to social engineering, they break the feedback loop. They stop selecting for competence, and they start selecting for ideology or loyalty to the new regime.
And our sources show this forms what's called the iron triangle.
Yes, the iron triangle, a classic concept in political science. You have the special interest groups, the regulators or administrators, and the legislative committees all forming a closed loop. They protect each other.
The revolving door.
A revolving door. They rotate in and out of these positions. They all speak the same language. They share the same luxury beliefs, and they completely insulate themselves from the consequences of their policies, which are felt by people like David and Sarah.
This circles right back to the Cantillon effect, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The people in that iron triangle are almost always the first spenders.
Almost without exception. They're the ones benefiting from the printed money, from the government contracts, and from the captured institutions. Meanwhile, the rationalist segment of society, the engineers like David, the scientists, the people who believe in hard reality, they feel betrayed. So what do?
They check out. They leave, like Julian did.
They check out, and when the competent people leave, the institutions decay even faster. It becomes a death spiral.
When you lay it all out like that, it really feels like these three stories, David, Sarah, and Julian, they're not three separate stories. They're just different faces of the same prism.
They absolutely are. Let's connect the dots one last time. David is the victim of the economic engine. He's being crushed by the Cantillon effect.
The money is rigged.
Sarah is the victim of the social collapse. She's drowning in Anomie.
The future is broken.
And Julian is the witness to the institutional breakdown. He's watching elite capture destroy the very mechanisms of repair.
The watchdogs are complicit. So the rigged money creates the deep insecurity that leads directly to the anomie.
And the institutions that should be fixing the money and stabilizing the society are captured by the very elites who benefit from the rigged system. It is a perfect, self-reinforcing cycle of decline.
It's heavy. It's a lot to process. And I think for anyone listening, the natural question has to be, what do we do? If the autopsy is showing systemic failure across the board, do we just give up? is it hopeless?
No. And this is where the sources, surprisingly, offer a very specific, if somewhat stoic, path forward. One of the articles we read talks about the road to decivilization, but it ends with this concept called the perspective of civilization's night watchman.
The night watchman. I like that image. It's not a general, it's a watchman.
Right. It suggests that the task right now isn't necessarily to storm the citadel. The institutions are too captured. The momentum of decline is too strong. The immediate task is to practice what the author calls tragic heroism.
Tragic heroism. What does that mean?
It means acknowledging the reality of the winter we are in without giving in to despair. It means preserving the firebrands for the future.
Firebrands. Yeah. Like embers from a dying fire.
Exactly. We have to keep the tools of analysis sharp like understanding the Cantillon effect so we don't fall for the prosperity unleashed narrative. We have to preserve the principles of sound money. On a personal level, we have to protect the sanctity of the family and our organic social bonds, even if the wider culture doesn't support it. We have to be the support network for each other that the state isn't providing.
So it's about guarding the seeds, protecting the knowledge and the values that will be needed to rebuild.
Exactly. The goal is to guard these truths for when the thaw begins, because eventually the mirage always fades. Eventually the 2.7% inflation floor crushes the ceiling, or the demographic anorexia catches up with the economy. Reality always wins in the end, and when it does, society will desperately need people who remember how things actually work.
That brings us all the way back to that couple in the coffee shop. The news ticker was screaming prosperity unleashed, but they knew, just by looking at their own laptop, at their own bank account, that it was a lie. And maybe that's the first duty of the night watchman.
I think it is.
Just seeing the truth.
Seeing it, naming it, and refusing to participate in the lie?
Yes.
That is the beginning of the cure.
The audit is complete. The diagnosis is clear.
Yeah.
But the vigil continues. Thank you for diving deep with us today.
Thank you.